Crimea is the decisive terrain of this conflict. The Ukrainians could kill every Russian soldier within 150 miles of Bakhmut. It would not change the strategic outcome. You liberate Crimea, that changes everything. So how do we do this? First, you have to isolate it by severing the two links that connect Crimea to Russia. The first, obviously, the famous Kerch Bridge, and the Ukrainians have already hit it once, and I suspect they'll revisit it again. And then, of course, the other is the so-called land bridge. And the Ukrainians have already demonstrated the ability to hit some bridges around Melitopol. But the purpose is to begin to isolate that peninsula, to start making it very uncomfortable for the Russians who are there. This is going to require more long-range precision weapons. If the Ukrainians had ATACMS, for example, 300 kilometers, they could already be making Sevastopol untenable for the Black Sea Fleet, because it's about exactly 300 kilometers straight line distance from Odessa to Sevastopol. But if they don't have those things, then they've got to get closer with so that they can start using the HIMARS launchers using the GMLRS 90 kilometer range weapons. So we're going to try and isolate Crimea. And then I think sometime this late spring, early summer, of course, I don't have access, nor should I have access to the General Staff's actual plans, but my sense is that they are building up a very powerful armored force. They're keeping them out of the fight around Bakhmut, because that is not the main effort. That's important, but it's not strategic. They're saving in a very Clausewitzian way. They're building up an armored force. And I think they also are husbanding some of their Air Force to be able to launch a deliberate strike that will break the so-called land bridge, probably somewhere between Melitopol and Mariupol, somewhere in that area, attacking on a narrow front. The fact that the Russians have fortified almost 900 kilometers, that's a great thing, because that spreads them out. Ukraine does not have to attack on a 900-kilometer front. I imagine it'll be something more like a 50-kilometer front that could penetrate using tanks, armored engineers, artillery, close air support, that will sever that land bridge. And now Crimea is totally isolated. And then you can start bringing up HIMARS using what they already have. And all you got to do is hit Sevastopol, you hit the air base at Saki, you hit the big logistics hub at Zhankoy, hit these places, and then the Russians cannot use Crimea as the launching pad for all the things that they're doing. I think every taxi driver in Kyiv probably knows where everything is on the Crimean Peninsula. There's nowhere to hide. It's about the size of Massachusetts, I think. There's nowhere to hide. We just have to give them the long-range precision strike capability to begin to hit it. And then, at some point, they'll have the, I think this will change the dynamic in the Kremlin so significantly that there won't be a lot of enthusiasm for continuing the fighting up in the eastern part of the country, because Crimea actually is all that matters. What's lacking from the administration is clarity about our strategic outcome. I mean, to say that we're with them for as long as it takes is not a strategic outcome. That's avoidance of declaring a strategic outcome. And of course, the ambassadors that are on this call have had a hand in helping to craft American foreign policy objectives before. That is one of the hardest things, to make very clear, this is what we want to achieve in this particular situation. And they just haven't done it. Once they say, we want Ukraine to win, and that means, of course, full restoration of all sovereign territory, then all the excuses about, oh, it'll take too long to train, or this tank burns too much fuel, or we don't have enough, all those excuses fall away. But they can't bring themselves to say that yet. At the Munich Security Conference, I had a chance to talk to, let's just say, a that's three very senior defense official who had a view. And then I also spoke to another very, very senior, person from the Joint Staff that said they don't need F-16s, or Crimea is not an important logistics base for what the Russians are doing in the east. And I'm like, they completely missed the whole point. So there's nobody in the Pentagon, I shouldn't say nobody, but the leadership in the Pentagon is not thinking about Crimea as the decisive terrain. I mean, when the secretary says we want to give the Ukrainians what they need to push the Russians back, that's the opposite. That's 1917 linear thinking. Instead of, what's decisive. We take risk over here so that we can get the decisive terrain that changes everything. This is classic Clausewitzian thinking instead of the linear thinking that I hear coming from. I think that what we have not provided to the Ukrainians is the adequate long-range precision strike capability that they would need to accomplish what I suggested. And they're not going to, as long as they don't think that Crimea is the decisive terrain. And so another person that I spoke to at Munich, who would, let's say he's a very, very, very senior executive for one of the top investment firms in the world, said there will be no investment in Ukraine unless Ukraine has an ironclad security guarantee. So that means, for sure, as long as Russia controls Crimea, the Ukrainians will never be able to use their ports on Azov Sea, even if Berdansk and Mariupol are completely liberated. Odessa will never be able to do what it's supposed to do for this export economy, as long as Russia sits there in Crimea. And then, of course, everybody knows that this will be the start point for the next Russian-Ukrainian conflict, whether it's 1, 2, 3 years from now. So as long as Russia occupies Crimea, there's no investment, which means that the 4+ million Ukrainian refugees that live here in Germany or Poland or the Netherlands will continue to have to stay out here. The millions of people that depend on Ukrainian grain will still be waiting on it unless a Russian inspector allows a ship to depart. So if we think beyond just purely operational, where I already think that Crimea is the decisive terrain from a strategic sense, Crimea is the decisive terrain, but the Pentagon is not thinking about it that way. And so that's why they say things like, well, they don't really need F-16s yet, or they don't need ATACMS, or they say things like, well, the Ukrainians are using up too much ammunition. They need to change their approach to doing this. Now, to do this, what doctrinally would be called a penetration here, once the ground is dried and hard on a very narrow frontage, I think it will be a comprehensive, not just tanks leading the way, but there's going to be partisans and special forces deep on the other side of where this penetration is headed. I think that the Ukrainian Air Force is actually saving up pilots and aircraft for this. I hate talking about specific platforms because then you get twisted up about how much time it takes or how hard it is to use that particular system, instead focusing on capabilities. But the kind of systems that do provide that capabilities, we've already talked about ATACMS, we've talked about F-16s, ground launch small diameter bombs, and also the Gray Eagle drone with a 25-hour loiter time. I mean, there are capabilities out there that could deliver the effect that Ukraine needs, but the administration has to say, yes, we're going to do that.